2023, I read 39 books, which is not a lot, especially because I read pretty short books, but 39 is a number. It is a number more than 0, which is the number of books I read in the cumulative 5 years before 2023. So whatever number you want to give me, I'm proud of myself. So with that being said, I'm making this video for two purposes. Number one, I started taking notes on some of the books that I was reading later in the year, and I would take them in post-it notes, but post-it notes lose their stickiness after a while, so I had to convert all of them into pen notes at the end of the year, erasable pen, because I have a crippling fear of commitment, but still, I had to convert everything into underlining with actual pen, and as I was doing so, I was like, man, I got a lot of thoughts about all these books I read. So that's one thing. The second thing is I have no long-term memory. So I'm making this video so that there's proof that I read these books, because I'm not going to remember anything about them in about 4 months. So yeah, I'm just going to go through all the books that I read, give my thoughts on them, talk some shit, give some praise. It'll be good. Alright, so let's get into it. Elevation by Stephen King. Stephen King, you may have heard of him. He has written many books that are very well acclaimed. He has also, unrelatedly, written this book. This book, it's a bit of a mess. And honestly, I don't even know how I got this book in the first place. It's one of those books that's like, it's been on my shelf for 4 years, and I don't know who gave it to me. I definitely didn't buy it. So I don't know how it got here, but I read it finally this year. I had never read anything by Stephen King before. I know that obviously he mostly does horror books. This is not a horror book. This is like kind of sci-fi. It's about this guy Scott who lives in Maine, shockingly. He's losing weight, but he's not getting smaller. So it's like the mass is leaving his body, but he's not losing weight in the traditional sense. Like he's still eating the normal amount of food. So that's like Stephen King's little sprinkle of bullshit magic that he puts into all of his books. The thing with the book is that while he's obviously going through this like sci-fi plot, there's a parallel of him having this character arc. He's gone through like a divorce or some sort of separation, and so he's now trying to make connections in the town that he lives in. He's kind of living this isolated life, and he's trying to make up with these like lesbian neighbors that he has, which I'll get into how he does that in a little bit. But the problem with this book is that it's kind of like the worst case scenario for a novella, where it doesn't have the weight of reading like a whole novel. At the same time, you still are committing to reading this whole thing. It's not like a short story where you can read this in like 20 minutes. I think I read this over like 4 days or something. It just ends up feeling really hollow. I'm gonna go into plots of a lot of these books because I'm obsessive and I have nitpicks. If you care about spoilers for any of these books, I will announce everything and I will wear this hat when I'm spoiling stuff. This is the spoiler hat. I talked about the lesbian neighbors that Scott has this like feud with. The way that the book ends up resolving this is that Scott gets like superhuman cardio from losing all this weight but still having strong muscles, and so he enters this like 5K, and then he finds out that one of the women in the lesbian couple is like a semi-professional distance runner, and so she's like obviously taking it really seriously, and then he makes a bet with her that he can beat her, and she's like, stupid man, it's phrased as if it's like she's being cocky, but it's like she's literally a professional runner. Of course she thinks that she can beat him in a race. He's like an overweight, middle-aged man. And then he ends up beating her, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. Like, if you wanted to make amends with a person, why would your strategy be like, oh, I'm going to publicly humiliate them by beating them in a race that they very publicly said they were going to win and should win easily? For some reason, like, it works. It's like, she's like, how did you beat me? And then they become friends. It's like, the whole town already hates them because they're homophobic, now she just got her ass whooped in a race, which is supposedly the one thing that she's good at. I don't understand this plot point at all. It feels like Stephen King was trying to shoehorn in like a moral thing about like hashtag stop being homophobic. He's not homophobic, and then he continues to not be homophobic because homophobia is wrong. Spoiler hat off. I'll probably read more Stephen King in the future, but this is not a good book. Read this if you want to take great photographs, and then there's 3 different ones. There's of people, just the regular one, and of places. So these are just 3 very light, guidebooks for photography, which is a hobby of mine. The contents in here aren't really that interesting. There's just a lot of really pretty photographs in here. But what I do want to talk about is the spines of these books, okay? These books, right? They're published by the same company. They have the same design language. They're clearly supposed to be in a series. So why is the original one the only one that has his name on the spine? The other ones have it imprinted, but they didn't fill it in with any ink, so you can't see it. On the front, none of them, they all just do the imprinting thing. So it's like, they're all perfectly aligned here. Then when they get to the spine art, they're just like doing whatever they want. You would think it would be easy when you're publishing a series, make sure that the spines line up. That's what people are going to look at if it's in a bookstore or in a library or in your own house. But as you will see in the future, clearly it is not. Because like almost every single series, they fuck up the spine art. And I don't understand why. Anyways, that's all I have to say about these. Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami. This is the first Murakami book that I read this year, of which there were a total of 6. So you're going to be seeing a lot more of this guy. But before we get into the book, we have to do a little more spine art scrutiny. I don't know what the hell is going on here. This is the one that started my feud with the spine art thing. These spines are a disaster, okay? They're just all over the place. So all the books are the same height and width, which is good. Like, that's a good start. And then everything else is just complete nonsense. The placement of the text is inconsistent. For some reason, Norwegian Wood, it's like higher up on the spine than any of the other ones, even though the title isn't any longer. The author's name, sometimes it's higher up, sometimes it's lower. The font sizes are different for some reason. They split up first person singular into 2 lines, because I guess the title was too long. But then the elephant vanishes, which is a longer title. They just made the font smaller and put it on 1 line. The worst thing of all of them is the logo itself at the bottom. The logos themselves are not aligned at all. And it's more than just the fact that the printing itself is like inconsistent. Like, they clearly just placed it by hand every time wherever the hell they wanted. But worse than that, they can't even make the logo the same size. For Norwegian Wood, for some reason, the logo is like 30% smaller. It doesn't make any sense to me because, like, wouldn't it be easier to just make a template and then you could just switch out the name of the book? Everything else can be the same for every single one. But they insisted on, like, not standardizing it and then remaking it every time so it just looks close to correct. But close to correct doesn't matter when they're all next to each other and you can see all the differences. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, I got it out of my system. We can talk about the actual book now, which is very good. I mean, there's a reason I read 6 different books by this guy this year. I like his writing style a lot. His general themes are very consistent. Like, the style is like very reflective, peaceful. The main character is usually this kind of unambitious guy, doesn't really have any big motivations, but he just kind of walks around and life pushes him wherever it wants to. That's definitely the case here. Obviously, Haruki Murakami, Japanese author, but has a very Western style of writing. By Western, I mean, he talks a lot about, like, domestic urban life. You know, his characters are more likely to drink Coke Zero than, like, green tea, if that makes any sense. General synopsis: a quiet and kind of listless college student. His name is Toru. He develops 2 romantic relationships over the course of this book. One is to a woman named Naoko, who was kind of his high school friend of a friend. The other woman is this woman named Midori, who is this very perverted and kind of sexually depraved or sexually liberated woman that he meets outside of school. All of the classic Murakami themes are here, even though this doesn't have any of his classic surrealism. There's tragic romance, there's kind of this ambivalence that absorbs the narrator, and there is sexual perversion all over this thing. I mean, Murakami has like a reputation for talking a lot about weird sex stuff, and if that's a turn off for you, do not read this book, because that is in here a lot, and it's central. I mean, like, this goes on and on about it in a way that you really feel Murakami's personal touch. There's a lot of titties in this book. I won't get into the ending here in case you want to read this, because I like this book so much, I think you should go read it, and I don't want to spoil it. But there is a sense to this ending that reminds me of Pinkerton by Weezer, which generally I already think that Murakami and Weezer are like the same. It's a big Venn diagram overlap. It's like version core, basically. But yeah, the album Pinkerton, much like this book, is really interested in exploring and pouring out this like depraved sexual desire, but it's not really interested in resolving it. It's just kind of like, this is what it is, and I'm sorry, but oh well. I have a lot more thoughts about this book, and maybe I'll go into them sometime in a different video, but for now, I can just say that I like this book as a whole. I mean, clearly I liked it enough to keep reading Murakami, so there's that. We will talk more about him later in this video. The Sellout by Paul Beatty. I first read Paul Beatty summer of 2022. Since then, I've read all 4 of Paul Beatty's novels. I have all 4 of them in these Picador editions, which reminds me, it's time for Spine Art Scrutiny. These are pretty bad. I thought they were good at first glance, but the more I look at them, the worse they get. The main sin is the changed font size for the White Boy Shuffle. That can be somewhat forgiven because the title and author's name would just be too long if kept at the original size. But on the other hand, like, I'm pretty sure that that book came out first, so there's no way they like couldn't have anticipated that when they made these editions. Just make all of the font smaller, or do it in a different way. Worse though is the way that they misaligned the author-title combo for Tough. Like, I assume they thought that there'd be too much blank space at the top because the title is so short, but just it looks so bad. I don't like it. Okay, so The Sellout. I believe that this is the most like critically acclaimed novel by Paul Beatty. It won the Booker Prize whenever it came out. I think it was like 2016 or something. It's not my favorite novel. Maybe that's because I'm not smart enough. Maybe that's because I appreciate different things about Paul Beatty's writing. But like all of his novels, it is incredibly dense, incredibly funny, and is tackling these issues and ideas of race in America in a very bold way. Beatty's prose is just, I love it so much. It's like fucking apple pie or some shit. It's so thick and hefty and dense. It's a little ridiculous for me to like get up on some stage and be like, here's what I think about this novel's exploration of being black in America, because, you know, I'm only half black. But the themes in this novel are really great, but they didn't really ever click with me the way that all of his other books did. All 3 of his first-person novels have kind of a very similar main character. They're irreverent, they are kind of troublemakers, and they're ridiculously smart and verbose and quick on their feet, as is necessary because of all of the jokes that they're being involved in constantly. Another strength of Beatty's is writing these really funny, really strong and vibrant side characters. This was another place where, even though it's like still done really well, I think this book does this the least well, in my opinion. If you've read Paul Beatty before, you'll like The Sellout. Very well written, and it's well acclaimed. if you haven't read Paul Beatty, you should start. I would start with The White Boy Shuffle. I think it, on the one hand, it's kind of the most contained, the most focused view of race that he ever put out. And it's also his first novel, so you read that first, and then you can move on to all these other novels. The Sell It, though, wouldn't be a bad choice either. Radio Free Album by Philip K. Dick. I kept pronouncing it Album, which is wrong because the L is before the E, so I think it's Album, but that is just a mouthful. I've only read 3 Philip K. Dick books, 2 of which are these Mariner editions that I read this year. 2 is just enough to compare, so you know what that means. We got to do some more spine art scrutiny. This one, it confuses me at the same time that it breaks my heart. They're so close. Everything is perfect. None of the titles are long enough. Even though The Man in the High Castle, you think, oh shit, that's a pretty long title. They might have to go to 2 lines. No. They thought ahead of that. But then they just went and made the header like a centimeter longer on one of them for no reason. At the bottom, it lines up. So I don't think that this is like them being offset in the printing. I think that they did this on purpose, but I can't imagine why. Either way, it's inconsistent and automatically fails, unfortunately, because it's so close. Although these covers are kind of plain, honestly. Like, you look at classic science fiction covers, and then you look at new ones, and it's like, it's a modern tragedy what has happened here. Okay, so anyways, back to the book. Radio Free Album. This is another book that I owned forever and then never read. Finally got around to it this year. Philip K. Dick has never had one of my favorite writing styles, and I'm not exactly sure why, but I think the best way to sum it up is that what I enjoy about science fiction is not what Philip K. Dick enjoys about science fiction. I did really like Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. In any case, I'm still drawn to Philip K. Dick books because they're very accessible. I don't read a lot of sci-fi, so it's like, if I'm gonna read sci-fi, I guess I'm gonna read the sci-fi dude sci-fi. If anyone has any other recommendations that aren't Dune, I would love to hear them. This book has kind of a weird, confused origin. Phil K. Dick wrote an original manuscript for this, based off of some weird drug trip he had. He sent it to the publishers. They were like, this is okay, but we want some like big plot changes, this and this and this. And Phil K. Dick was kind of like, okay, you know, at this point, I'm just going to rewrite. I'm going to write a new book. And he wrote what's called the Valis series. Then later on, his friend had kind of like put together an edited and completed version of that original manuscript, and that's what this is. So this book has a plot point. It has a character named Valis in it, but it is not the Valis series, even though it is kind of dealing with the same ideas as the Valis series. So very confusing. I don't know why they chose to publish this at all, and I especially don't know why they don't mention that origin like anywhere on this edition, but whatever. I still read it. This book is fine. It's kind of the classic Philip K. Dick thing of like meta-reality, and there's gods behind the scene pulling the strings of everything that happens in the world. Like I said, Philip K. Dick wrote this as a response to this like drug-fueled ultra reality experience that he had, and yeah, that definitely tracks with what's in here. There's some thought-provoking ideas in here, but a lot of it just comes through as like complete gibberish to me. This is a little bit spoilery, but like I said, there's a character named Valis, and I just do not understand what Valis is supposed to be. It's kind of God, but it's kind of an alien race, and it's kind of a computer, and somehow this all has to do with the Roman Empire. I don't know. It felt like this is something Philip K. Dick wrote for himself to try to make sense of a drug-fueled experience, and I didn't have that drug-fueled experience, so I don't know what the fuck is going on. So yeah, I mean, this book is enjoyable as like a general adventure novel, but in terms of the philosophical implications that it was trying to get at, I did not really synthesize any of those. I didn't know what was going on. But I'm glad I read it. I'm glad I got it off my shelf, and I'll probably continue to read more Philip K. Dick in the future. Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. I was supposed to read this book in high school, but I did not. I got like a third of the way through, and then I stopped reading. Partially because COVID hit, and partially because, you know, no stupid teacher is gonna tell me what to do. I'm not gonna read some stupid book. I'm gonna sit in my room and watch 9 hours of Instagram every day. So I only got around to this one last spring. It's a genuinely great book. There is a serenity and a freedom, which is a main theme of this book if you didn't know, freedom, to floating down this river in all of these different settings and all of these different lightings. The river is painted in so many different beautiful ways that it feels like it's changing even more than the human characters in this book. It winds through these different states. You get the weather in all these different places, the wildlife, the color of the water. It's just amazing the way that he paints this portrait of the Mississippi. Spoiler hat on, but the ending to this book is garbage. Honestly, it is impressively terrible. Like, considering how great the first 85% of this book is, the last 15% almost ruin it, which is amazing because the first 85% is so good. Basically, the emotional climax of this book should and is the moment where Huckleberry Finn decides, like, to save Jim from slavery. He's going along with it the whole time, but he doesn't really give a shit about slavery. He's just doing it because, like, you know, he'll help anyone that he's next to. It's just, you're here, I'll help you. But at the end of the book, he does have this reflection point where he realizes that slavery is wrong and that his friend doesn't deserve to be a slave, even though he's been told his whole life that that is the way it's supposed to be, and that he will go to hell if he tries to stop this guy from being sold back into slavery. So that should be just the end, right? Like, he should do that and then save Jim in some great action sequence. There's other really great action sequences in this book, and then that should just be the end of it. But instead, bafflingly, Mark Twain decides this is the perfect moment to just, like, interrupt all the narrative momentum and reintroduce Tom Sawyer from Adventures of Tom Sawyer, who is just trolling the whole time. Like, I mean, it's like a 25-page bit where Tom Sawyer is trying to convince Jim to break out of prison in the way that, like, old Western novels portray it. Like, Jim, like, literally is out of the shack where he's being kept on, like, page 200, and then for 25 to 40 pages, they're just, like, fucking around, and they're like, no, go back in the shack, because you gotta dig a hole under it, and you gotta, like, whistle through, you gotta, like, make an instrument out of a leaf or whatever. It's just such a stupid joke, and he does it for so long, it almost feels like Mark Twain is intentionally trying to punish me for reading this book. It's just so confusing to me because, like, I find it hard to believe that Mark Twain doesn't feel strongly about slavery, right? Like, that's the whole point of the book. But then the way that he treats the ending to this book, it's almost like he just thinks it's a big joke. It completely dissolves all of the tension that the reader is supposed to feel for the future of Jim, because the future of Jim and his life is, like, just turned into this comedic device. So dramatically, you kind of remove the main thing that you're supposed to be caring about. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Spoiler hat off. So yeah, this is a great book, even with the ending. And if you're thinking of reading it, I would recommend getting an edition with some annotations. A big part of this book is the way that different characters talk, the class differences, and some of that language is just lost to time if you're not familiar with how people talked in, like, 1852 or whatever this book takes place, like early, like mid 1800s. So having annotations that just explain, like, this is what this word means, this is why only Huck would say a word this way, that really helps you get more of the, like, social dynamics of what Mark Twain is writing about here. Slumberland by Paul Beatty. We have another Paul Beatty novel here. This one takes place in recently reunified Berlin. It's the only book that doesn't take place in America as far as I can remember. And it is the setting of this novel that I think really makes it work for me. Everything in this book feels smoky. Whether it's like these misty European streets or like a cigarette-filled bar, there is this kind of haze that surrounds everywhere that the narrator ends up. There's also this sense of uncertainty and fog surrounding this bigger conspiracy that the narrator kind of gets caught up in as he is searching for this elusive jazz musician named the Schwa. The book is definitely structured more around like individual comedic bits than it is around like one really strong straight line plot. So you don't have like really big unanswered questions that you're dying to know about the whole time, but the writing is so strong, the humor is so strong that you continue reading anyways. It's still captivating. Spoiler hat on, but I want to talk about one specific bit that has like stuck in my mind ever since I read this, which is the reason that the narrator knows the Schwa is in Berlin is because while he's working as this musician that's like scoring the music to these porno films, he gets a package, he gets a VHS tape from Berlin that is a saxophone solo by the Schwa that is the most like romantic, beautiful piece of music ever written, and it's set to a video of a black man fucking a chicken. But the music is so beautiful that he has to play it every time he makes love to a woman in his house. So he just puts the VHS tape in and then drapes like a rug over the TV so that it's such a funny visual of a woman being like, "Oh, this song is amazing. What's the video?" He's like, "Don't worry about the video." Spoiler hat off. So again, love this book, and I'll reiterate: if you're in the mood for a book that's funny but is not compromising on substance, that is still making really intriguing and interesting points about race, Paul Beatty's your guy. His books have some pretty acrobatic and dense prose, but it's nothing that's like too challenging. And if you can get by that, there's just so much funny stuff in here. Inspiring and funny. First Person Singular by Haruki Murakami. Another Murakami book. This time it's a short story collection. A fairly recent one. I think this came out in like the last couple of years, maybe 2020. It's hilarious to me because this book is thicker than Norwegian Wood. Like, it's physically a larger object, but they made the font size so much bigger that the actual length of text here is like way smaller than Norwegian Wood. I don't know who decided this or why they were like, we need this book to just be 240 pages long, even though it's about 110 pages worth of words. But I guess that's what they decided on. It's kind of a weird choice for a second Murakami novel. He has kind of a lot of major works that are considered like the Murakami classics that I haven't gotten to yet. This is not one of them, but I had to pick it up because it has a monkey on the cover right here. And most of the cover arts for these vintage editions are just pretty boring. So I saw a monkey and I leapt at it. There's a good mix here of like explicit magic stuff. The monkey that you see here can talk, which is another classic Murakami thing, talking animals. There's some surrealist stuff, there's slice of life stories. The general thread that ties all of these stories together is recollection, memory. And I'm not sure if that was like an intentional editing choice or if that's just what Murakami has been writing stories about now as he gets older. He's in his 70s now, I think. But my favorite thing about these stories is that like a good few of them feature a narrator that very plausibly could be Murakami himself. So when you mix that into all these other stories that have like more clearly fictionalized characters, it makes the surrealist stuff feel even more interesting because it's like further blurring the line between reality and fiction. So overall, this is not one of Murakami's strongest offerings, at least in my opinion. But if you like Murakami and you haven't read this, yeah, you'll like this. It's more Murakami. Sputnik Sweetheart by Haruki Murakami. Yeah, so back-to-back Murakami here. A little update on the Spine Art Scrutiny. I already talked about my main issues with these Murakami editions, but I'd just like to point out that the cover for this one is so misaligned that you can see the front cover like seeping over onto the spine here, which is just pretty awful quality control, to be honest. Anyways, this is a shorter novel, and it has a pretty, it's like the AI generated Murakami plot. There's a main character with a weird name. He's just called K, and he's in a love triangle with this longtime friend of him named Sumire, who he's been in love with for many years, and this older woman that Sumire ends up falling for, named Miyu. Sumire goes on a trip with Miyu, and then she goes missing, which is, first of all, if you're a woman in a Murakami novel, like, fucking get your affairs in order, because there's a 50% chance you're either being murdered, you're killing yourself, or you're going missing. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, but it's just probably going to happen. He's probably going to use you as a tool for the main male character to, like, be sad and be like, emotions. That's usually what happens to women in these novels. I like this book well enough. It kind of is, it's dealing with the same idea of desire, but removing a lot of the more uncomfortable aspects that were in Norwegian Wood. In doing so, though, this book inevitably loses some of the depth. It's losing some of the weight behind the gut punch that it's giving you, because it's not as brutally honest. Spoiler hat on, but Kei's desire for Sumire is not challenged through this book to the extent that Toru is kind of like tortured for falling in love with Naoko in Norwegian Wood. Yes, he has to deal with unrequited love, but first of all, the character is older. He's already been out of college for several years, so there's not that same feeling of helplessness. Toru, as a college student, is having to come to grips with what it means to be in a mature relationship. He doesn't even really understand what it means to be in love with someone. Kei and Sumire are a little bit more stable, and while Kei does have to come to terms with what the platonic relationship with Sumire is, they seem to already have a general understanding of, like, with how they feel with each other, how they can be friends, and, like, what that relationship is. I think the most interesting part of this book to me is that, I would argue it has a happy ending. It's a little neater than, like, most Murakami endings, where usually, like, a woman will go missing, and then it's like, we're never seeing that woman again. They are not going to resolve that in any way. Here, you actually get to see, or you at least get to hear from Sumire again. There's no reunion, but there is this sense of, hey, this chapter is closed. Just the fact at all that she's not totally missing by the end is, like, a shocking thing for Murakami, because so often people just go missing, and then the ending is just the person being like, well, I guess they're missing forever. I think this book is a lot more digestible than Norwegian Wood. It's not dipping into, like, potentially triggering subjects as often as Norwegian Wood does, in terms of, like, self-harm and gross sexual stuff. That's not really triggering, but it's just, like, kind of a lot. It's a much shorter read. It's an easier read, but it didn't leave me with as many burning questions, as many, I don't even want to say, like, positive outlooks. It's just, it's not as much of an impact as Norwegian Wood did. Profiles in Ignorance by Andy Borowitz. Nonfiction. One of the genres of all time. And Profiles in Ignorance is one such example. This was a Christmas gift that I got in 2022, I believe. This book is essentially just a compilation of dumb shit that Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and Donald Trump have done over the years. So there's a slightly comical tone here. Not so much like the examination. Like, the examination is very dry and factual, but they kind of do Daily Show style bits where it's like, Donald Trump would later say that the blah 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 was like blah blah blah. Maybe he should have adapted the same policy towards his Dunkin' Donuts intake. It's like that kind of shit. But beyond, like, just listing stuff, there's a focus on trying to understand how American politics got from a place where you had to kind of pretend to be the smartest guy in the room, pretend to be really, like, upright and civil, and understanding everything to now, where it's like you're supposed to just be like inflammatory and be a dick, and if you try to be intelligent and actually qualified, it makes it harder to elect you. I kind of had a roller coaster experience with this book. I had the same struggle with it that I have with most nonfiction books, which is just like sometimes sections will just go on, and it's just like a list of information, and at a certain point I just stopped being able to take any of it in. The funny anecdotes kind of help, but still there were parts where it just kind of felt like it was dragging on for me. I think my favorite section here has to be George Bush, because, and I already felt this way before I read this book, but George Bush is hilarious. Like, everyone talks about Trump and how ridiculous Trump is, but Trump at least feels like Trump liked being the president, even if it was more about his ego than wanting to like enact policy changes. Whereas like George Bush, I feel confident in saying that he would be significantly more happy managing a Chick-fil-A than being the president of the United States. Like you know those movies where someone is like, you know, they live like a normal, simple life and they're kind of a dumb guy, but then they turn out to be the heir to like some fortune, and now they have to be the CEO of some giant corporation. We basically did that with George Bush. It's like he just wanted to be a rich Southern idiot, and then they were like, no, you have to lead the free world through this like war. And he didn't do a good job. He did not do a good job at all. I'm not going to use a spoiler cap because this is nonfiction, but after the main like chronological section of this book, there's kind of an epilogue where the author is recapping everything, kind of finalizing his point about this trend in politics, and then also trying to give some advice on how do we get back from here to a better place in American politics. And I don't know about this ending part, you know, because I get the desire to end the book on like a high note, especially after spending 300 pages just talking about how screwed up American politics are. But to me, it comes off as a little cheap. The section is so short compared to the other parts of the book. It almost feels like a punchline in itself, right? Like, you just spent 12 hours reading about how fucked we are and listing hundreds of examples of how terrible all of our USA politicians are, and like Donald Trump has done all this horrible stuff that's going to extend far into the future. Ronald Reagan set all these horrible precedents that seem like they have no sign of stopping. George Bush did all these things that are going to affect the world forever. And then right at the end, the author's like, but if we all stick together, guys, we can do anything if we put our minds to it. It's like, I don't know, man. It kind of feels like we just gotta take the L on this one, given the information you just presented to us. Overall, this is a fine book, although I think for me personally, having all these examples of political ignorance and stupidity in one place, it's not really necessary. Like, that's already what all the news is anyways. It's just like, hey, here's another stupid thing that a politician said. Did you know that we're all screwed and that the federal government is a nightmare? Like, having a book that's like Ronald Reagan did dumb things and Donald Trump did dumb things, that's not compelling to me. But it is very well researched, and if you want to kind of reach into the mind of these guys, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Donald Trump, this isn't too bad of a place to do it. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy by Douglas Adams. I'm going to tackle all 5 of these books together because the plots obviously do follow each other, but the books are more about like individual situations and scenes, and those all just get jumbled up in my memory anyways, so I'm just going to talk about them all at once. But first though, a little bit of spine art scrutiny. These ones are almost perfect. You can see here, I was so worried because there are so many different editions of these books that I just bought all 5 of them at once. I got this nice little box set. Because I was worried about having different editions, and I thought, you know what, if I get all of the editions at once, they'll just match up perfectly. And they're even displayed like this, with all the spines next to each other, so how could they not be perfect? Well, I'll tell you, they're almost perfect, except that the title of the last book, Mostly Harmless, is in a slightly different shade of white than all of the other ones. Now, I think I know why this happened. You can see that they put the author's name in a different color in each one, and for the last one, it's this off-white. It's like a light blue. And then I think they just copied that white over to the title. So the whites match within the individual book, but now the white doesn't match with all the other books. Some people might not care about this. They might not think it's a big deal. I see it as a wasted opportunity, but that's just me. Back to the books. I would describe the Hitchhiker's Guide series as punishingly British. What do I mean by that? Everyone in this universe is supposed to be sad all of the time. If there's one lesson that these books teach, it's that happiness is inevitably a trick. Happiness in the Hitchhiker's universe is it's like the lure of a lanternfish. Like you think it's the light of the sun, but really you're just about to get swallowed by some horrible monster. Nobody in these books ever gets what they want forever. They might be happy for a moment, but that is only to set them up for an even greater issue of doom. Arthur Dent, the main character, is abducted from Earth and proceeds to spend 4 out of the next 5 books in this just perpetual loop of being confused by space stuff. No matter how much time he spends in space, that's just always his role, is to just be like, what? Do you have the BBC? That's what he does the whole time. Which, I guess, from a comedic perspective, you need someone to be confused for like all these wacky space jokes. But when you read all 5 of these books back to back to back to back to back, like I have, it starts to get a little old. I'm putting on the spoiler hat because I want to talk about 2 specific things. First of all, my favorite book from the series, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, which seems to be somewhat of a controversial take because from what I can tell, So Long and Thanks for All the Fish generally considered like one of the weakest or the weakest entry in the series. And I'll give you one thing, it's definitely the least traditional, but that's exactly why I like it. I mentioned that Arthur is in this perpetual state of basically he's just like a punching bag for the rest of the cast. All the Fish is the exception to that. He's finally empowered and kind of actually taking actions and being ambitious for the first and only time in the series. This book is also a romance. I mean, there's like hints of a relationship between him and one other character at the beginning of the first book, but that's more of like a comedic thing. This is like a legitimate, serious romance, and I really liked it. Fenchurch, the romantic interest, I thought was really funny, really well written, and there's a whole bit in here about him teaching her how to fly that I just thought was really beautifully written. The problem with All the Fish is that you don't really get to see much of the other characters at all because everyone is so spread out, and Douglas Adams is constantly having to find ways for all these characters to kind of reconvene because these books have no issues with sending people like across time and across the universe. People just end up in the middle of nowhere constantly, and then he has to find narrative reasons for them to all actually get together again, which leads me to my other point. Man, do I wish Douglas Adams had been able to write a 6th book. I know he was starting to write one when he tragically passed away, and I know that it was Ian Coffer, or however you pronounce that man's fucking stupid name. I know he eventually wrote a 6th one, but I've heard pretty negative things about that book. I'll probably read it at some point, but man, is the ending to this series a downer. Before I even finished the books, I had read a quote from Adams talking about, I want to write this 6th book because the ending is kind of in a more negative, nihilistic place, which is probably the understatement of the century. If you're willing to hear the spoilers for the whole series, I mean, it's not, people can die and come back to life like it's nothing in these books, so in terms of like narrative, it's not really a big deal that this is how it ends, but it is how it ends, so if you're not willing to hear that, everyone dies. Just everyone dies, and it's not even like it's tragic but we accept our fate, like in the Toy Story 3 fucked up incinerator scene. Like, no, these characters die in panic and fear. They do not accept it at all, They have not made peace with the world in any way. Arthur Dent dies horribly. Arthur Dent's child, who is still grappling with the regular cosmic horror of, like, you know, being a 15-year-old girl or whatever, she also dies and gets evaporated. And that's not even to mention that at the beginning of the last book, Fenchurch just is lost in the middle of time forever. And again, this is like a narrative thing where Douglas Adams needs a reason for Arthur Dent to, like, not be content. So it's like, you had that happiness, we're taking it back, because it doesn't work if you're actually happy this whole time, which is a shame, because I really like Fenchurch, and I wish they could have found a way to get this plot moving without having to get rid of her, because I think it really could have made this book more interesting to have a new character interacting with new people. I know you get that with Random, but Fenchurch, I feel like, is much more fleshed out than Random. Anyway, spoiler hat off. I like these books a lot, but I think I would have enjoyed it a little bit more if there was more of, like, an explicit overarching plot. Like, not that that is a failing of these books, it's intentionally episodic, but that's just, I think, what I enjoy more. The book does a lot of great work in kind of acting like a skit show. It's setting up these funny scenes, and then they pay off within like 20 to 30 pages. Sometimes they'll pay off at the end of the book, but not really any farther than that. Reading all these back to back, though, it starts to get really stale. You start to just be like, where, like, when you're reading them back to back and you're trying to keep track of where characters are, you're like, I don't know what the hell is happening. People are just, someone's a million years in the past, and then they time travel to the future, but it's in a parallel universe, in a pocket dimension, in a VR simulation. It's kind of a mess, and maybe I'm just stupid, but I could not keep up with it. Also, the crew, the main cast, they, like, never like each other. They never learn to like each other. They just fight the whole time, which again is very British, but it was just a little sad to me. I just wanted to see these guys get along a little bit, or at least by the end. The Forbidden Territory of a Terrifying Woman by Molly Lynch. This book wins my award for most hard to remember title of 2023. I don't know how many times I was recommending this book or talking about this book to someone, and, like, I accidentally called it The Terrifying Territory of a Forbidden Woman, or The Forbidden Terror of Being a Woman, or The Lost Territory of the Vanishing Woman. I'm not sure if that's just me being an idiot, or if it's actually the name being confusion. It's an open question. This book talks a lot about a lot of things that I am not qualified to comment on. Motherhood, fatherhood, serious relationships, preserving fruit, lots of stuff that I just have not done, not my area of expertise. But the book does manage to broach these subjects in a way that still spoke to me, despite my lack of experience in any of these areas. I really feel like I can feel the stress of these characters as it goes through the story. Like, Danny, who's one of the main characters, I won't get into spoilers, but I felt like I could just see lines under his eyes and around his forehead, like, forming through the pages. It's just like he's just not having a good time this whole book. The main plot device of this story is this nationwide phenomenon of mothers that just start disappearing without any explanation. And I think, at least the way it's approached originally, I really like the way that it is explained. It's not specifically, like, paranormal, but it's not specifically scientific as well. And yet, despite there being, like, no mechanism that really tries to explain this, it comes off as uniquely believable. And I think that's because of the way that the characters respond. People are responding in the way that real characters would. On the one hand, you're like, is this God? Like, am I in hell? Is that what happened? Did I go to hell for stealing all of those preserved fruits that my wife made? On the other hand, they're trying to find a scientific explanation for it. So, as the reader, I found that search very interesting. What I didn't like, spoiler hat on by the way, is that later in the story they start to explain partially what the disappearance is. There is a paranormal aspect to it, definitely, and that is kind of kept open, but there is a section in which we get to see the character that was missing during this time, and to that character the disappearance feels like it's just a time skip, but to everyone else it's weeks or whatever, and yet we see this footage of them walking around. And to me, that was kind of an interesting choice, because I think it's much more interesting if you're not sure which one really happened. You're not sure if she was even in reality at all. I think the more that you explain explicitly about what happened, the less possibilities the idea of this disappearance has for what it can symbolize. You know, I just think that, for me, the phenomenon of the disappearances, it feels very domestic. It feels personal. It's tied to how these women are being forced to live as mothers, like what that responsibility means. And yet, when you start to explain it in any sort of scientific way, now it starts to kind of cast the whole experience in a more cold and scientific lens. Once there's an effort being paid to supply like a practical explanation for what's happening, it's just making me think like, oh, there's some scientific explanation for why they disappeared, and that to me is leading me down the wrong path of thought for what this book is trying to get across. Spoiler hat off. I have a couple other things that I want to point out about this book from just like a curious standpoint. First off is this book has really short chapters, to the extent that like clearly it's a creative choice to make the chapters this short, but I'm not sure what that creative choice is. It has regular double line breaks, but then just like there's sections where the chapters are like literally half a page long, and I just stopped paying attention to the chapters at all, because they're happening so often that it's like I don't even know what chapter I'm on. See, like this chapter 28 here is like one page, and I found that in maybe 10 seconds of searching. Secondly, I haven't read that many books, so like maybe this is a common thing, but this book has the weirdest formatting for dialogue I have ever seen. They indent for every new speaker like normal, but then there's just no quotation marks. Like, why? I'm not judging, I'm asking. It feels needlessly confusing to just do all of the formatting for dialogue and then just not put quotation marks. Like, in this section, can you tell where the dialogue starts and where it ends? I couldn't at first, because I'm an idiot, clearly. But I just kept thinking like, wait, is this still a person talking, or is this just description? And I feel like if you just added quotation marks, I would know what's going on. This book is your classic, what do we do? The world is dying. I guess we just love each other and write books book, It has lovely writing. It explores some very big questions about our planet's future, about what being a mother means, about how us humans should view nature. Everything in this book is damp. It's just constant dirt and dust and mud everywhere, all over this thing. It's a good book. I recommend it. The Guest Cat by Takashi Haraide. This is a quaint, short little book. Another one that is originally written in Japanese. Very peaceful, very serendipitous. There's this couple. They're both writers or like editors or something. They work from home, and they take up this lodge that's like on the property of a bigger mansion. It's kind of this like shitty little apartment. So their life is very monotonous. They like stay in the house a lot. They don't really go out to that many social events. And then this cute little cat starts wandering into their apartment, and the couple just develops this really sweet, very unique relationship with the cat. You see the couple start to like project themselves onto the cat, and it leads to this really funny situation where, despite they know as much about a cat as anyone knows about any cat, but like they don't even know the cat's real name, and yet they start constructing all of these ideas and patterns and rules about the cat that are reflections of their own lives. It's a very homey book. This is the kind of book that like you should read in a hammock under like shadow of like a vine or something, with like the wind flapping all the pages as you try to read it. Death in Her Hands by Ottessa Moshfegh. This is a dog shit book. I'm sorry, that's unfair, but I did not enjoy this book. I'm gonna put the spoiler hat on right away, because I have a lot of things to talk about here, okay? So the main theme of this book is that the narrator, this old woman, is like spiraling into insanity, and slowly she's revealing more and more about her past and some of the trauma that she's been through. She becomes obsessed with this note. It's basically like a prank note that she finds in the woods that implicates someone as being a murderer, and she starts inventing this story around how the murder happened and why. So this woman is losing her mind, but the whole time we're seeing it from her perspective. So the book is almost entirely internal monologue, and Moshfegh really wants you to like lose grasp of the objective reality to the situation. So like, not only is the character in a physically isolated position, like they live alone in this quiet neighborhood, but we also just don't really get any information that isn't filtered through the narration. There were some parts of this book that I thought were very well done. The protagonist is likable enough to start that you don't really want to believe or write her off as crazy at first. You keep going along with her until she gets more clearly detached from reality. The problem with this book for me is that, one, the insistence of internal monologue just makes this thing drag on. Like, I got so tired of having all this information come through this very easily distracted, very paranoid grandma. 2/3 of the way through the book, and it's just like, shut the fuck up, woman. Oh my god, she won't stop talking about just random other shit, which I know is the point. I know the point is that she can't stay focused because her mind is deteriorating. But I don't want to read all about it. I want to see the crazy stuff that's actually happening. It's so annoying. The second problem is that once you've hit the point of like, okay, this woman is falling into insanity, the book doesn't really have anything else left to like hit you with, you know? Like, yeah, you learn more about the woman's past, but I wouldn't say that you really get any like shocking information. I mean, it's shocking compared to what we knew at the beginning, but it's not like some crazy story where, you know, she murdered her husband or something, which would have been cool. It would have been awesome if that's what happened. Maybe that is what happened. I just had no reading comprehension. Very possible. But for me, I was just like, what the hell? It's just your boring ass life story. That's what the secret was this whole time. All the stuff that you learn, it's not like it reframes what you saw earlier in this especially satisfying way. It's just like, oh, okay, she was being nice before, but now she's being mean. Spoiler hat off. I know that this author is pretty popular these days. I've heard her name before, so maybe if you liked some of her other work, check this one out. If you're the kind of person who believes being a white woman is the hardest thing anyone can ever do, you probably already like Ottessa Moshfegh. Koji Kondo's Super Mario Bros. Soundtrack by Andrew Schartman. This is more of like a thinking man's book. A little spine art scrutiny. These 33 1/3 books have pretty good consistency in terms of their design. The only thing I'll say is that they changed the font for the series number, which I'm pretty sure they did just because they didn't expect the series to ever go more than 100 books, but clearly it did. So we'll give them half points for that. These books, if you don't know, are pretty much like overviews of classic albums, and this one is about Super Mario Bros. The big problem with this book is, and it says so itself on like literally page 1, there's like 90 seconds of total music in this video game. And this book is like 120 pages long, so that's almost a page per second of music. This thing, it's almost impossible for this thing to not feel bloated, despite the fact that obviously it's a really small book. I read this in like one day. Schartman tries to get around the limited material in two different ways. First of all, he kind of expands the scope to talk about the historical context of the entire video game, not just the music. And he also dives into the like philosophical aspects of Koji Kondo's work. I think that first method works a lot better than the second one. The problem trying to get into the philosophy of Koji Kondo's work here is like, I mean, I'm glad that he respects this guy's work, but I don't think it's that deep, man. Like, there's a whole section here where he's talking about how the sound effects are pairing the like timbre with the narrative action associated with it, and he calls it Mickey Mousing, and it's just like, it's like a 10-page section, but if you think about it, it's like, what's really being said here? That the one-up sound is designed to sound positive because the one-up is a positive thing in the game. Like, yeah, that's just how sound design works. I don't really get what you're talking about. I think this book would have worked better if it was a section of a bigger book about Super Mario Bros. Because then you could trim this down. There wouldn't be the expectation that this is like 120 pages long. If this was like 30 pages long and in a 150-page book, I think it would, get across the interesting information and not feel super bloated. The Elephant Vanishes by Haruki Murakami. This is another Murakami short story collection. This one was published a lot earlier than First Person Singular. I think this is from the 90s. I think that the main thing I noticed reading this in comparison to First Person Singular is that while there are some serious stories in here, there's like a lot more stories that go a lot goofier than anything that's in First Person Singular. So you still have, like normal, reflective, peaceful stories in here, but you also will have ones that are just like, what if a goofy goblin showed up in your house and asked you to marry him, So yeah, this whole collection kind of takes on the character of being less reined in, being a little bit more varied for the good and the bad. There are more stories in here that I thought were like utterly forgettable. 100% for Perfect Girl, Fall of the Roman Empire, stuff like that. On the other hand, you get some really eclectic, beautiful stories that are just interesting and kind of inexplicably appealing. There's a story in here called The Second Bakery Attack. Spoiler hat on, but basically what happens is the main character and his wife end up attacking this McDonald's. And there's just there's a quote in here that I love so much. He goes, why my wife owned a shotgun? I had no idea. Or ski masks. Neither of us had either skied. Barn Burning is another really great story in here. If you've never read Murakami, I think Barn Burning is like the perfect encapsulation of his style and what he does really well. I'm sure you can find it online if you've ever wanted to get into Murakami. So yeah, another great book. If I had to compare this to First Person Singular, I would say this book has higher highs and lower lows, but overall it is just a little bit more favored by me than the other book. The Lemon by S.E. Boyd. So I don't own this book. I bought most of the books that I read this year, but a couple of them I read through the library, and this is one of them. This book is centered around the death of a famous food critic who dies while whacking off in a hotel in Ireland. It's this firecracker of a plot starter, and the whole rest of the book is just watching like fallout of this event as it kind of spirals through the different tendrils of the media, the different arms of the food world and the TV world. All the characters are kind of trying to avoid the inevitable chaos that's coming from this moment, and yet you, as the reader seeing it all from top down, you see how hopeless it is. Like, it consumes everyone. It completely, like, just no one is able to escape the chaos. And you have some people that are trying to profit off of it. You have some people that are trying to contain the entire thing. So really, as a reader, the fun is kind of watching all these people try to react to the chaos, try to get ahead of it, and of course, knowing that it's pretty much impossible for them to do that. It's a little bit like, if you've ever seen the slow motion scenes in Jackass, where an explosion will go off and then everyone's trying to run away, but they're just getting hit by shrapnel and they're getting thrown across the room. That's what it feels like reading this book to me. Spoiler hat on, but there's a death at the end of this book that I thought was written in a really unexpectedly beautiful way. It's a character that's more of a comedic presence during the entire book, but during their death, The prose is written in such soft and detached language that it almost feels like we're watching the scene happen in shadow. When you have a book that weaves together so many threads like this, I think it's pretty hard to not have some of them feel like they're not as well developed, or maybe it's just a personal thing that they're not connecting to you as much. I definitely did get that sense from this book, but I think that there's a good chance if you read this, you are going to connect to at least one of the storylines that gets presented here. Yeah, I really enjoyed this book. It did make me Google whether or not Anthony Bourdain had really killed himself, or if he had just been jacking off with a noose around his neck. Could not find anything to suggest that, but the timing of this book is very suspicious, so I'm going to keep my eye out in case any new information comes to light. Abba Gold by Elizabeth Vincitelli. Yeah, we have another 33 and a third book here. I know you're probably thinking there are 170 entries into this series and you chose Abba Gold and the Super Mario Bros. Soundtrack. That's what stuck out to me. I'm not gonna fucking defend myself to you. This book is funny because I feel like the conceit of all of these books is like you're supposed to come into it and then get like a greater appreciation of these albums, and like that's definitely what this book is trying to do. But I feel like I read this and I just kept thinking like, man, does ABBA suck? Like, this book really says a lot of pretty negative stuff about this album on the way to trying to prove that it's deserving of like a classic status. Vincitelli, she insults the lyricism, she insults the production, she insults the fact that the female members of the band didn't really get to make any creative contributions. They call them gay. She insults their drip at one point. I mean, this book is pretty brutal. It honestly made the book a much funner read for me because the writing didn't feel like it was super straitjacketed around like trying to create this narrative the way the Koji Kondo one was. There were a lot more twists and turns as Vincitelli will bring up a song and then be like, actually this song kind of sucks ass. My favorite anecdote from this book was the revelation that Kurt Cobain, of all people, was apparently a huge ABBA fan. I do think there's something interesting about examining ABBA Gold in this way because ABBA's reputation is so weird. I feel like everyone loves at least one ABBA song. If you don't like at least one ABBA song, you're just a dick. And yet, somehow, despite everyone liking their songs, ABBA maintains this like constant punchline. So this book is kind of examining like how that reputation became ABBA's legacy and whether or not it's really deserved. I'm definitely going to read more from this series in the future. I'm shocked and disappointed that there's no Pinkerton one yet. Come on, guys. But yeah, pretty good book. How the Word Is Passed by Clint Smith. I read this book for school, and I'm going to abstain from most judgment here just because I mean, this book is amazing. I have nothing to add to this book whatsoever. It's obviously really well researched. It's well acclaimed already. It's amazing, but it's way too smart for me to be like, here's what I think about it. I'll just bring up, if you haven't read this, one crazy anecdote that stuck with me from reading this book. This book is structured around the author traveling to these different places and reconciling their relationship with slavery and discrimination and just African American history in general. In one section they go to this Angola prison that's built on a former plantation ground, and there's a quote here about prison employees that basically lived like they were slave owners well into the 20th century. I mean, the quote here from Patsy Dreyer is just insane. I mean, it's like, you read this and you're like, when was this person born? Like 18-52? And then you look and it's like, holy shit, this quote came out in 1990. You've Got Mail was out. And this woman was publishing quotes about how awesome it was to live with slaves. And the great thing about this book is that kind of craziness is all over it. Like, this dude just brings up so many incredible stories. I mean, it's obviously a very heavy book, but if you're willing to take the dive into that, I would highly recommend this book. And it's going to teach you something that is more important than like ABBA trivia. So there's that. Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. If you don't know what this book is about, look it up. It's a very famous book, and I'm sure there are 1 million synopses that you can look up on your own discretion and not fucking make me do it. It's about war. It's about how the memory of war impacts you for the rest of your life, how war changes you, ostensibly. The main character of the story, Billy Pilgrim, he is the victim of an alien abduction that you can't quite tell if it canonically happens or if it's more of a coping device. In either way, the unsticking of time that he undergoes after being abducted is symbolizing his relationship to memory and to his life, looking back on the experiences he had during World War II. There are passages here about the alien race, the Tralfamadorians, that are just beautiful and kind of eye-opening. I mean, it's iconic for a reason. This book is amazing, and if I could recommend one passage from this book that you have to read, look at the reverse war movie passage from this book. I believe it's on page 93. It's just amazing, and it's like a page and a half long, but just communicates this really simple idea in a really beautiful way. Kurt Vonnegut was kind of known for being a famous humorist, and I think it's interesting, the humor in this book is very sneaky. There's not like big wacky moments that Vonnegut's putting in here for the sake of being so wacky. There's just really clever, really funny one-liners kind of sniped into random spots in this book, so you never know when the next sentence is going to be either completely mind-opening or just hilarious. I definitely want to read more Vonnegut this year, and yeah, just another great book. 1004 by Ben Lerner. There's this quote from the author John Haldeman, which goes, "Bad books on writing tell you to write what you know. A solemn and totally false adage that is the reason there exist so many mediocre novels about English professors contemplating adultery." That quote was on my mind constantly as I read this book. This is one of those books where the narrator is like kind of meant to be the author himself. Ben Lerner works as a professor at Brooklyn College, so does the narrator here. Ben Lerner, at the time of writing this book, had just had his first novel have kind of an unexpected amount of success. So is the protagonist in this book. Adding to that kind of meta aspect of this is that there's a part in this book in which the narrator publishes a short story in which the narrator of the short story is himself a self-insert character of the narrator who is the self-insert of Ben Lerner. So the parallels here are obviously intentional. It's not just being written for the sake of, oh, this is what Ben Lerner's been through. He is trying to do something here with the relationship between an author and his work. The plot here is not treated as especially high stakes. They're not world-changing events, even though there is the potential for the main character to die. It's not on whether or not he's going to die. Ben Lerner is setting up these situations to have the character reflect on these really big ideas, whether that's life, whether that's love, whether that's family or fulfillment. So it sounds like this kind of thing would be right up my alley, but honestly, I didn't really like this book. I think that the internal dialogue was a little bit too abstract for my taste, not direct enough. Like, I'm just an idiot. I need stuff to be spelled out for me. And this guy really likes to write about these big, reaching ideas, and he kind of just will randomly insert these really convoluted metaphors that I can't understand. Spoiler hat on, but I also think it's kind of an interesting choice by Lerner to make the main character such a self-insert when he has some pretty questionable sexual behavior in this story. It's established that his friend Alex is trying to conceive a baby, but she doesn't want to be in a relationship. She wants him to artificially inseminate him. She wants him to artificially inseminate her. At the same time, there's kind of this unrequited love that he has for her. So there's a weird sort of asymmetry in the relationship. And that's a big part of the book, is the narrator reflecting on trying to balance his responsibility as a friend with his own desire, especially as he looks forward to being a father and trying to make that kind of unique family situation work. It's pretty potent stuff, but for me, it was hard to get into it because before any of this happens, there's a scene where the narrator admits to like purposefully sexually assaulting Alex. I mean, it's not graphic, but I just don't know why did that have to be in the book at all? At that point, I'm like, oh well, fuck this guy. I don't care at all about him. He's like taking advantage of this woman that supposedly he cares about. So I don't know. From that point on, it was like, I don't really care if this is like hard for you to decide whether or not you should sleep with this woman or not. Like, I already kind of don't like you at all. And then at the end, it's like, it doesn't make any sense. Alex decides that they're not going to use artificial insemination because it's not working for some reason. I don't know if that's a real science thing or not, but basically she's like, we're just going to have sex and then you'll get me pregnant. But she hasn't, it's not like she's changed her mind and they want to be in a relationship. She still is like, we're just friends. You will have limited involvement in the raising of my child, but you're just going to fuck me to get me pregnant. It felt a little bit fantastical. It felt almost like fetishizing. And again, it's all compounded by the fact that this character is like almost being the same guy as the author. So I'm just like almost cringing the whole time at what's going on. This book definitely has a specific appeal to it, and it's very willing to go into the minutia of the implications of every little thing you do. You know, every action is, how does this reflect on you as a whole? How does this reflect on the world as a whole? And if you're not down for that, or if you're just not down with like the weirdness of the narrator here, then you can skip this thing. I mean, I'm sure this is someone's favorite book, but it's not mine. Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller. Okay, this book is a doozy. Let's just get into it. This book exists somewhere between biography and memoir. The author, at the beginning of this book, has undergone this great loss. Her life is kind of falling apart. She's spiraling. And I'll get into exactly what happened in a minute, but that is the starting point of this book's narrative. She's lost, she's hopeless, and then she finds out about this historical figure, David Starr Jordan, who was a taxonomist, who also had a really great loss in the middle of his life. He basically had his life's work destroyed by an earthquake, and she reads about how he never lost faith, he never lost ambition, even through this hardship, and she's kind of inspired to figure out, like, why was he able to do this and I'm so incapable of doing it? A big part of this book is the author struggling with this mindset of cosmic unimportance. You know, it's a thing you've heard people say, like, on a universal scale, you're just this tiny little speck of dust that exists for a tiny little speck of time, and then that's it. You don't really matter. And some people are able to live with that and just go, I'm just going to be happy for the sake of me being happy. There doesn't need to be any bigger reason for the meaning of life. But for some people, including the author, they have a really hard time getting over that. And it makes them feel like nothing, and it's just really hard for them to continue knowing that and feeling like that. So it's a really cool setup, and I like, actually, the tension here between the author consciously understanding that it's true that she doesn't matter on a cosmic scale, but it doesn't sit right with her, and more importantly, it's not helping her feel better. So she's trying to change herself to understand that philosophy so that she can get on with her life. Spoiler hat on, but my problems with the book come during the last third, during which there's kind of this double plot twist. Basically, we find out, and maybe you already knew this, David Starr Jordan is a fucking monster. He was a eugenicist, and not just like casual eugenicist, but like head of the American Eugenics Committee eugenicist. Like, really into eugenics. Kind of crazy. Like, you see how crazily he's into fish early in the book and taxonomy. He is just as crazy about eugenics, it turns out. And it's kind of specifically confusing for his legacy, because his whole thing again is like, you know, humans aren't any more important than anyone else, right? Like, individuals don't really have any sort of cosmic or divine purpose. We're all just these products of evolution. And yet for a guy who's talking all about how evolution is great, he really likes playing God and deciding who deserves to live and who deserves to die. On top of that, there's this second revelation that a lot of the work he did in classifying different types of fish has kind of been overwritten recently in the world of taxonomy. Thus the title, Why Fish Don't Exist, because recent taxonomists believe that there really is no such thing as a fish as a collection of species. Here is my problem with the twist. Just because someone that disagrees with you is a monster does not mean you are right about everything. Miller tries to spin this twist about Jordan, which, by the way, is already kind of fucked up, that you've spent this story building up a eugenicist for dramatic effect. But she goes from the downfall of David Starr Jordan to kind of reflecting on her original mission. And she has this moment where she's like, well, if David Starr Jordan was the reason I was trying to adapt myself to this philosophy of accepting my unimportance, and if he's actually a monster, then I never really needed to change my philosophy at all. Which doesn't make any sense, because again, as I said, just because someone is a monster doesn't mean that is like the opposite of that. It's like, he can be wrong and then another person can be wrong in a different way. Two people can be wrong and disagree with each other. So that annoyed me. And then secondly, it's like, again, going back to the way she builds up this eugenicist, this is like, the whole book is just professional hating. Like, she sets up the whole story to be like, it's going to be about her growing as a person, learning how to reconcile the truth of her cosmic unimportance with the human need for self-confidence and self-image. And yet, the whole journey is actually just like a setup to prank us and be like, huh, looks like I was right the whole time. She revels in the fact that Jordan's work has been disproven, as if it's not incredibly common for a scientific consensus to change after 150 years. Like, yeah, his work is no longer considered to be true, but his work led to the work that taxonomists are doing now. It doesn't make sense to me to be like, see, it turns out he was wrong, and his life was meaningless. She's taking it as this weird moral victory. And again, it's weird that she seems kind of like taking comfort in the fact that this guy was a total monster, because she's like, thank God there's an explanation for someone disagreeing with me. Don't get me wrong, there are really great sections of this book, and I do think that this book is promoting a really important idea. There are sections of this book that deal really intimately with survivors of eugenicist efforts, survivors of sterilization camps. I'm not trying to pretend like this book is presenting some negative message, but I just think narratively, the downfall of David Starr Jordan is presented as this liberating moment for Lulu Miller. So there's this weird sort of dichotomy between, hooray, she doesn't have to accept this universal truth, which we could argue about that, but at the same time, it's like, okay, but you realize that by finding out that this dude was a fucking monster the whole time. These pseudo-biographies, these types of books that are examining another person's life, but really only as a way to show their context in the author's own life, I just don't think these books are for me, man. You know, because when I'm reading this, it's like David Starr Jordan's life sounds fascinating, and this woman's life does not sound fascinating at all. It sounds boring as shit. I mean, David Starr Jordan, this is a guy who really thought he was doing the right thing his whole life. His entire life, he thought he was dedicating his life and his work to discovering this universal truth and acting in like God's image. And then 100 years after his death, it turns out that he's actually one of the most destructive figures in American scientific history, and he also totally murdered a woman, which is a story in here that is amazing, and we don't get to talk about it that much because Lulu Miller won't shut up about her own life. Oh, and by the way, the great loss that this author went through, the one that she compares to David Starr Jordan losing his life's work in an earthquake, is that she cheats on her long-term boyfriend and then gets broken up with. How are you comparing that to a natural disaster? You did it yourself. It doesn't make, it's, whether, I'm not trying to like blame you for being sad, even though, I do kind of have a hard time empathizing with someone who's, cheated on her boyfriend and then tried to sweep that under the rug for the next 200 pages. But, like, even if I could get past that, it's a completely different situation than what this guy went through. Because he couldn't have done anything to stop that earthquake. So, of course, it's going to be easy for him to say, the only thing I can do is carry on and continue working. You directly caused your own downfall. So, of course, you're going to struggle with your own self-image because you did a shitty thing. Spoiler hat off. I'm sorry, I don't like this woman at all. She has such a poor attitude. She's so defeatist. And the ultimate takeaway of this book is deluded. It feels self-absorbed. I don't like it at all. And I was thinking about where my frustrations with this book really stem from, and I think if there's one quote that sums up the entirety of what this book is about, it's this. It's on page 88. Lulu Miller says about David Starr Jordan, "He was sounding more and more like my father." Daddy issues. It always comes back to daddy issues. Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, unlike some certain other authors that I may or may not have recently talked about, is a genius. I mean, she's definitely in the pantheon of American fiction. Obviously, you didn't need me to tell you that. Obviously, I also read this book through the library. Everything in this book, to me, feels like it's sepia colored, It's nostalgic in a way, both from a personal perspective. It's the main character looks back at their childhood during the early parts of the book, but also in a wider sense, it's about a family looking back into its history. Also, it's just hot all the time. Like, they go to Virginia and it's just, I feel like I was sweating just reading this book. It's so, there's like a yellow summer haze over the whole latter half of this book. Morrison's writing in this book is it's so rich and it's so perfectly considered. Like, everything in this book feels like it's just perfectly placed. All of the character names are perfect, even though they all have ridiculous names. They all feel like they fit perfectly. The characters in this book, they're all dealing with these compulsions to do what they feel like they need to do, whether it's Macon Sr. or Hagar or Guitar as a Sunday man or even Milkman. They're all doing things that they don't even necessarily want to do. It's deeper than that. It's like they feel like they have to do it because of the circumstances of their lives. Basically, the only exception to this is Pilate, who at first seems like this crazy old woman, and then as you read, you realize she's the only one who's content in any way. When this book ended, I felt like I too was trapped in that warm summer haze. Again, this book is so rich and it's so jam-packed with symbolism. There's so many different connections between the characters in this story to religion, to the patriarchy, to disenfranchisement. I feel like I could read this book another dozen times and still be getting new ideas out of it because it's just so jam-packed. This book is a little bit almost too big for me to even comprehend. There's so many layers. The image being presented is so big, I feel like I can't comprehend it all at once. Kumquat by Jeff Strand. Sorry, I forgot to hold up my fake microphone for that last book. Sorry to break the illusion for you. So now we go from one of the most complex and nuanced books that I've read to the most paper-thin one that I've ever read. I heard about this book on a Reddit thread about romance novels written from a male perspective, and I had just heard that this book was funny, so I picked it up. Jeff Strand, who is apparently Matthew Perry's alter ego, he writes this story about our main character, Todd Bryan, who falls in love with this woman, Amy Husk, who is essentially his soulmate, except that she has this inoperable brain aneurysm that's going to kill her at some point in the near future. The two end up going on this impromptu road trip, and would you believe it, some wacky hijinks ensue. This book is such a nothing burger, dude. Todd has the most calculated, inoffensive personality. You know, he makes these little quips, he makes pop culture references, he likes having sex with women in the most boring sense ever. You know, it's like Amy has sex with him and he's like, oh my god, boobies. So, you know, it's just, it fucking bit my tongue. It's like I got a tongue cramp or something. Oh my god. I think talking about this book is evil. Alright, I'll keep going. Amy, on the other hand, is just also the most nothing character ever. She has the classic love interest personality of like, you know, she's not a girly girl. She's just a normal guy. She's just a normal person. But she's also insanely pretty. And she's not a slut, but she's cool with having casual sex with Todd. And she also makes pop culture references. And she also says OMG boobies. I wish I could have the 5 days that it took me to read this book back. Also, physically, why is this book so tall? It's like goofily tall. It's the size of my whole head. I don't know why they chose to do this. It's not like the book is so long that they needed some giant, you know, pages to make it fit. Like, it's a pretty thin book. They just made it really tall for no reason. Listen, if you really want a comfortable romance novel, there's got to be a better one than this. I'm sorry. I am the most vanilla man ever when it comes to relationships, and even I think that these people are just fucking boring. They don't even fight in this book. What is the point of a romance if you're not ever gonna fight with each other? There's no tension at all besides the fact that she has this inoperable brain condition, but that's a shitty plot device because it can just happen whenever. There's no cause and effect at all. It's stupid. Thumbs down. Thumbs down for this book. This Bloody Mary is the Last Thing I Own by Jonathan Rendall. This is a really beautiful memoir from a boxing writer who also, I guess, was some sort of promoter or in the camp of Colin McMillan, who was at some point the WBO featherweight world champion. The characters in this book are presented in such a controlled and restrained manner. There are all these moments that feel like you're seeing the flicker of some deeper conflict within people. It's like the characters in this book are these little pieces of glass, and they're kept in shadow, and Jonathan Rendall is just pulling them momentarily through a beam of light, and you just see this rainbow explode out of them for just a second, and then boom, he puts them back into the shadow. So you get these beautiful moments, these beautiful revealing anecdotes, but ultimately the atmosphere is shadowy and it's somewhat depressing, and people don't really get to have their big moment for very long. That's the big theme of this book, is no matter how well you're doing, the sport of boxing is just this monster that chews you up and then spits you back out, right? And you try to get yours while you're in there, but ultimately it is not a home. It is not a place of stability. Rendall's writing is lyrical, it's mysterious. He carefully avoids referencing his lifelong gambling addiction, which, once I found out about that, makes this book make a lot more sense, because he rarely references it explicitly, but there's all these scenes where he'll be like, oh, McMillan had just won a big fight, the cash prize was huge, everyone was on the up, we're making it to the world championship, and then the next chapter will start, and he's like, I had absolutely no money. And you're like, how did that happen? So yeah, if you're interested in boxing at all, or even if you're not and you just want a look into a world that you're unfamiliar with, this is a really amazing book, and I highly recommend it. World War Z by Max Brooks. Zombies. Who doesn't love zombies? I mean, come on, you know, they're awesome. They're green. I mean, not in this book. They're not, actually. But, you know, They eat brains. Again, not in this book, but most. World War Z is all about reevaluating the conception of zombies. And Max Brooke is really trying to think about what would actually be scariest about a zombie apocalypse. Is it the fact that they look creepy? No. Is it the fact that they want to eat your brains? I mean, maybe, but lots of animals will kill you. The problem with zombies is that they look like people, but they don't think like people. And because they can't think like people, they can't give up. They just keep going forever. And as they grow in numbers, they become as inevitable as a force of nature. And the reason that the infestation is able to grow initially is because people try and fail to fight them like people. This book is written as an in-universe anthology. The narrator is going around and interviewing different survivors' stories about the zombie war. So it's not a spoiler to say that in the book, we eventually defeat zombies, at least to the extent that the world is recovering. What's really cool about this book is taking a more critical look on what a zombie apocalypse would really look like. So you have all of these different people that are responding to the same idea, but in different ways that all feel realistic and make you think, oh, I never thought about that. I never thought that that would totally happen if there was a zombie apocalypse. It's a really fun read. I enjoyed it. If you're looking for something that is really casual, is not exactly pulpy, but is more entertaining than it is challenging, definitely read this book. Starting Point by Hayao Miyazaki. This is the book that took me the longest to read this year, partially because it's a long book. It's almost 500 pages, and again, it's a giant book, so these pages are long, but also because I started reading this during kind of the height of my fall semester, so I had the most work while I was reading the longest book. I think I read like 80% of this on the subway to and from school, so obviously it took me forever. It took me like a month and a half to read this book. Hayao Miyazaki, if you don't know, is the legendary animator, founder of Studio Ghibli, Howl's Moving Castle, Porco Rosso, Kiki's Delivery Service, Totoro. The list goes on. This book is a compilation of writings that he had made from 1979 to 1996. So there's a lot of magazine articles in here, some interviews, and a couple letters as well. Being a big fan of Miyazaki's work, I'd always wanted to read this, not only because I was hoping he would talk more about his movies, but because from everything that I've seen about him, he has just some of the most interesting philosophies I've ever seen. I remember watching the documentary In the Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, and he repeats the sentiment in this book, but he's basically like, yeah, I've been a pretty shitty father. Which is kind of crazy to hear someone say while they still like have contact with their children. It's not like their children have like cut contact with him and he's had to reflect. Like, no, his kid is like working with him and he's like, I was not a good dad at all, but it is what it is. I will say a surprising amount of this book is more about like the practical side of animation, the workflow, rather than the creative work, which wasn't exactly what I was looking for in this book. I mean, it's interesting, but I've never animated anything. I don't really have any desire to. So those sections kind of just went over my head. There's also large sections of this book that are on films or TV shows that I've just never seen, you know? There's a big part on Conan Future Boy, which is a TV show I never watched. There's some parts about the Lupin movie, which I never watched. Despite that, though, I'm glad this thing exists, even if, for me, it could have been a lot shorter and still given me everything I wanted out of it. I'm glad they made this collection for other people that maybe are looking at him as an animation inspiration or just want to find out how these movies are made. If you're like me and you wanted to get into the creative side of Miyazaki's work, you can still buy this book, but maybe skim over it, look for sections that seem to be more about what you are interested in, because it can be a long read if you're just going to read the whole thing front to back. The White Boy Shuffle by Paul Beatty. We've arrived at the last Paul Beatty novel. Actually, it's his first novel, but the last Paul Beatty novel that I read, and dare I say my favorite. It might just be recency bias, but man, this book is so good. Again, this guy's writing is so fast, so jam-packed with wordplay and jokes and metaphor. And yet at the same time it feels meditative. It's filled with melancholy and quiet moments. The general premise of this book is that the narrator, Gunnar Kaufman, moves from Santa Monica to essentially a ghetto in California called Hillside. It's a coming-of-age story in which Gunnar is becoming recognized as both a national basketball prodigy and also this poetic prodigy. Looking back on this book with knowledge of what Beattie would go on to write later, you can really see how Gunnar represents sort of a prototype of Beattie's protagonist that he would extend upon when he wrote Slumberland and The Sellout. Gunnar is quick-witted, he's very poignant, he's intelligent when it comes to issues of race, and literally he's poetic. And yet there's also this frustration that he has that comes along with kind of being the Beattie protagonist and having that level of political literacy. A main theme of these books is how heavy the responsibility of African American history weighs on its bearers. The way that Gunnar Kaufman feels like he has to reckon with this every day because he's seen as being a representative of the African American struggle. Again, the side characters in this book are really amazingly written. Nick Scobie, who becomes kind of Gunnar's right-hand man, he has these two beautiful character traits, which is that he's also a basketball prodigy, and he's also obsessed with jazz. Throughout the book, he's listening to all of the albums he considers jazz in alphabetical order, from A to Z. There's also Psycho Loco, who is a hillside gangster that kind of takes a liking to Gunnar and welcomes him into this underbelly of crime. And I'm putting on the spoiler hat because this character doesn't come in towards the last third of the book, but Gunnar Kaufman ends up marrying this Japanese woman, Yoshiko, who is literally a mail-order bride. I was a little worried at first because, and maybe I'll make a video about this someday, but Beattie has a very interesting use for Asian characters in his books that I think is just defined by the topics he chooses to write about. But when I saw that there is a literal Japanese mail-order bride in this book, I was a little worried that she was going to be more of a punchline. But of course, Paul Beattie characterizes her beautifully. She ends up becoming one of my favorite characters towards the end of this book. Comparing this book to the other Paul Beattie novels, it's hard because all of his books have such an embarrassment of riches when it comes to funny situations and funny bits. But I think the reason why The White Boy Shuffle stands out to me is because as a complete story, this is the most streamlined, most concise, most fantastic story that I think Paul Beattie has ever written. It's a fantastic coming-of-age story, and now that I've read it, I guess I just gotta wait till Paul Beattie puts out another book, which might be in another 7 years based on how quickly he writes, apparently, but I'm ready for it. Hear the Wind Sing by Haruki Murakami. Alright, we're in the home stretch of Murakami now. This is a little 2-in-1 edition of Murakami's first two novels, Hear the Wind Sing and Pinball 1973. I got these because I decided I wanted to read through the Rat Trilogy, which is a Murakami series with 4 books in it. While these books span literal decades of canonical time, the two constants within the Rat Trilogy are the main character who remains nameless and this secondary character who is named the Rat. And in Hear the Wind Sing, we kind of get the origin story of their relationship, where the protagonist is running into the rat and proceeds to hang out with him at this local bar over summer break. Like I said, this is the first book that Murakami ever wrote, and you can definitely feel the roughness here. He is not quite as sure what he wants to do when it comes to his prose, but you can already see some of the trademarks that are gonna become Murakami staples later. Weird names, people with like vague past injuries, women that are disappearing from men's lives. However, the difference is that these tropes are more grounded than they are in later novels. Other than Norwegian Wood, this might be one of the most grounded stories that Murakami's ever written. There's not really any surrealist elements to it other than the weird injury and the fact that the guy's best friend is named the Rat. This is a pretty basic book, but I think one section that really did stand out to me is the characterization of the rat. He's just such an interesting character. And I really love this quote that he uses to start off chapter 25. It says, "The rat's favorite food was pancakes, hot off the griddle. He would stack several in a deep dish, cut them into 4 neat pieces, and pour a bottle of Coke over the top." That is such a great way of just describing something completely irrelevant and yet giving us a perfect image of who this character is. This is Murakami at his most conservative storytelling point, but we're going to start to see him ramp up as we move into Pinball, 1973 by Haruki Murakami. This book changes up the format a little from Hear the Wind Sing by splitting the chapters between 2 perspectives, which is something that Murakami would do a couple more times later in his career. We have first-person perspective from the nameless protagonist, and we also have third-person narration in alternating chapters where we follow the rat. The rat and the protagonist don't actually overlap in this book at all, I think. The protagonist is kind of dealing with an early version of the urban ennui that we would later become known for. The rat, on the other hand, ironically has the more human story and the more grounded story. He has this romantic relationship with a woman who also remains nameless, and for reasons that we're not really privy to, he ends up breaking up with her. I'm putting on the spoiler hat to talk about this more fully, but I think the thing that's so interesting about the rat is that despite literally being named the rat and being sort of this intentionally strange character, he is unmistakably, remarkably, debilitatingly human. And just as his character is simultaneously grotesque and yet endearing, his actions in this story are at once completely illogical and yet entirely understandable. The relationship between the rat and the woman, there isn't any scenes that are like Murakami showing us, oh, this is a loving relationship. We don't really see them go on any dates. I think they only interact within the woman's bedroom. And yet, he makes the tension of their relationship come across so clearly, and you can just tell the way that it is eating up the rat, although we're not sure why. I think the reason it works so well is because Murakami is leaving room for our imaginations to fill in the cracks in this relationship. In a way, he's inviting the reader to pour their own insecurities into the rat, because while we don't know exactly why he leaves the woman, we can all imagine the kinds of things that would make a person do that. This worked really well for me because I'm a straight man. If you're not, maybe it doesn't work as well, and you're just like, well, I don't understand, this guy's just a fucking idiot. We're all idiots. That's why it works. The only unfortunate thing to me about this plot is the way that it kind of sets the tone for another Murakami trope, which is the underutilization of female characters. There is just a graveyard of women in Murakami novels that are used as tools for male characters to have emotional epiphanies, and then they're just tossed to the side. So spoiler hat off, I did like both of these books, but I think more than enjoying them themselves, it makes me excited to read the 3rd and the 4th books in the Rat trilogy, and to continue reading some of Murakami's later works where he's building off of the ideas that you see kind of first explored here. Book of Haikus by Jack Kerouac, edited and with an introduction by Regina Weinrich. Not a whole lot to say about this one. Jack Kerouac, obviously not known for haikus, and yeah, we should keep it that way. Still though, there are some good haikus in here. I really like this one, and I also really like this one, which is, I believe, his most famous haiku. Generally though, this book felt more like writing exercises than like finished work. They also stray a lot from the original form of haiku, which is, I mean, it's pretty common for English haiku artists to drop the 575 requirement just because of how differently English and Japanese are constructed, but that usually means making the poem shorter, whereas Kerouac sometimes is like just writing whatever the hell he wants. He also focuses on more domestic subjects than traditionally haikus would. Mostly haikus are about painting a natural scene with some indication of the season. Kerouac is like talking about lawnmowers and like, you know, needing to return his neighbor's rake and shit. It's Sometimes the poem will just be entirely an internal monologue and have no reference to the scene at all. Sometimes he'll just say fuck it and only write 2 lines, and he still calls it a haiku for some reason. Clearly Kerouac is not interested in playing by the rules. And I appreciate it from a perspective of experimentation, but not many of these haikus really resonated with me all that much. The Hunter by Richard Stark. I heard about this book from the YouTuber Man Carrying Thing. It's a thriller mystery novel published in 1962. Dare I say, the most 1962 book ever written. The premise for this series of books, the Parker novels, is this professional criminal, this professional thief named Parker. In every book, he gets screwed over by someone, and then he gets his revenge. In this book, I don't know if this is how all of them work, but Parker's actually been screwed over by the time the book starts. The very first scene is him walking over the Manhattan Bridge, which is not what you're supposed to do. This book made me laugh in so many ways that are clear. They're not intentional at all, the way that this book made me laugh. Parker's character is so ridiculous because he's not supposed to be a good guy even for the time, but with 60 years since this book has been published, social norms have trended even further away from what this character is. So now he's just completely ridiculous. I'm going to put the spoiler hat on because I'm going to talk about some of the stuff he does in this book, but for example, on the back cover, it describes Parker as the ruthless anti-hero, and it's like, oh, okay, so what do they mean by that? Well, as I said, Parker starts this novel having been screwed over on a previous heist, and it turns out that one of the people that screwed him over was his wife. Not on her own will. She was told that she either had to kill Parker or she would herself be killed, and then they'd probably kill Parker anyways. So she does try to shoot him to save her own life, and then Parker proceeds to hitchhike across the country, limp into New York, figure out where she's living, walk into the apartment, and tell her to kill herself. Then, guess what? She does kill herself, and he just slings her body over his shoulder and throws her into Central Park. Then he goes on to get revenge on the other people that betrayed him, which mostly involves him murdering dozens of people. Some of which are completely innocent bystanders, just people being extorted by the mob that happened to be there. Alright, spoiler hat off, but another thing that's so hilarious to me about this book in modern times is Parker kills so many goddamn people in this book, and yet the possibility of the police being able to connect any of these back to him is just never addressed. He's tossing bodies around with his bare hands while wearing bespoke clothing, and then he just carries on with his life. There's no effort to hide his murders at all. The first thing he does when he gets to New York is he commits bank fraud in just the most 1960s basic ass way possible. He goes to the post office and he just says, "I lost my driver's license," and then they're like, "Oh, we'll give you a new one. What's your name?" And he just tells them a fake name, and he gets a fake driver's license. It's could you really do that? And it's just funny because the book is trying to set this up to be look how smart this guy is. He's such a genius. But all I kept thinking was if this is how easy it was to get away with crime in the 1960s, why would anyone have a real job? It seems so simple to just steal money from people, and the police have no chance of catching you. The final thing that I have to say about this book is that the ending, I feel, is really weird. I'm not even going to bother putting the hat on because it's not exactly a surprise. Shockingly, Parker succeeds in getting revenge. He doesn't die. This book has 20 sequels, so yeah, he doesn't die. What happens is that all the money he got through his revenge, he ends up losing it through this weird circumstance. And so you think, that's where the book would end, right? If this is an episodic book series, that's the perfect cliffhanger because it's Parker's alive, he's free, but he doesn't have enough money to be carefree, so he has to take on another job, presumably in the next book. But instead, they add this one chapter to the end of the book where Parker plans another heist, successfully executes it, and then gets enough money to get plastic surgery to change his face. By the way, another extremely 1960s plot detail, but it's just confusing to me because it feels completely unnecessary. If you look at a normal story arc, right, it's rising action, climax, and then resolution. And then if you're gonna do like an episodic thing, you might have a cliffhanger, so then you introduce some tension at the end, right? Like, this makes sense to me. But I've never seen a book that has this sort of twist ending that introduces tension right at the end and then immediately resolves it again in the same book. I don't even understand why you'd even have it at all. This is a really fun, fast book. If you are willing to kind of buy into the pulpiness of this novel, I think you're gonna have a good time. The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. We've arrived. This is the final book that I finished this year. This book is pretty famous. It's an alternate history story taking place in a world where the Axis powers win World War II. And then within the novel, there's a novel called The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, which is an alternate history book about the Allies winning World War II. So clearly, Philip K. Dick is, again, trying to get a little meta, talk about what's real, what's fake, who's pulling the strings. One thing from this book that I wasn't expecting to like so much is there's a plot device called the I Ching. It's a divinity scroll texting from China, and in the world of the Man in the High Castle, it's like this thing that has been kind of distributed throughout the new American society in the Pacific states that Japan controls. It's used to predict the future and kind of try to read the tea leaves of fate. I just like it because from a writing perspective, Chinese proverbs sound badass, and this is a good excuse to kind of pepper them all throughout the story. However, as the book progresses, you start to realize that canonically the I Ching works. Like, canonically, the I Ching can tell the future. It can actually tell your fate. And I realized like 2/3 of the way through this book, oh, Philip K. Dick totally believes in fortune telling. Story-wise, I don't know why I had assumed that the plot would be these characters trying to like overthrow the Nazi regime after the Nazis had already won the war, which it obviously isn't about that because that doesn't make any sense. Instead, we have a few different stories about people just trying to make sense of this new world, trying to find what their lives can be in this alternate reality. I think my favorite plot was there's a Jew who's obviously living in secret. His name is Frank, and he's trying to start a business where he sells jewelry, and he's frustrated because the Japanese people, who are the people that have the money to buy jewelry, they don't care about craftsmanship at all. They just want Americana. So there's this whole industry making like fake Honus Wagner rookie cards and like Coca-Cola posters and fucking, Pogs, or not Pogs, but like, you know what I mean. It's funny, and at the same time is really interesting. It's like, that 4chan post about the reverse weeaboo who like owns bullwhips and he's like wearing a cowboy hat? That's like kind of a similar vibe with the Japanese ruling class in America. I want to talk about the ending for a little bit, so I'm putting the spoiler hat on. The woman who is trying to find the author of The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, that's another plot. Her name is Juliana. Eventually, she does get there. She finds the proverbial Man in the High Castle, and she gets him to admit that he used the I Ching to write his novel, The Grasshopper Lies Heavy. So the novel is implying that there's something fated about the story. It's not just purely fictional. There's also this vision that one of the Japanese characters, Tagomi, has. He seems to phase into this other reality where the Japanese are the prosecuted ones, they're the second-class citizens, and white Americans are the ruling class. So taken all together, I've seen a lot of people imply that the ending is supposed to be like a fourth wall break, that Juliana and Tagomi and the author of The Grasshopper Lies Heavy, they are all seeing our world. They're seeing the truth, that in reality the Allies did win the war and that they're living in a work of fiction. To me, that doesn't make any sense at all. And I also don't like that. I'm not a fan of metafiction because it requires a mental contradiction that I can't do. But just like think about it. Like if that's the implication, right? So we're supposed to believe that Tagomi is traveling to the real world when he has the vision. And yet it's still happening in the book. So the book is it's bringing its characters to the real world, but it's also bringing attention to the fact that it's a work of fiction. So you have to have this mental contradiction where I'm reading the book and I know it's a work of fiction, but it's pointing out that it's a work of fiction and bringing the characters to the real world, but that's still happening in the book, which is obviously a work of fiction because you just reminded me that it's a work of fiction. It doesn't make any sense. I prefer a slightly different interpretation of the ending, which is more of just alternate realities. They're seeing not necessarily a truer reality, but just a different reality in which the Allies win the war. And there are a couple of things in the book that back me up on this interpretation. First of all, the world in The Grasshopper Lies Heavy is not our world. It's fundamentally different. FDR steps down from the presidency in a way that he doesn't in real life. So clearly Philip K. Dick is not implying that The Grasshopper Lies Heavy is supposed to be literally our world. It's just a world more similar to ours. Secondly, if I know anything about Philip K. Dick, then he does not believe that even our reality is any sort of true reality. Hashtag look up the exegesis of Philip K. Dick. So it doesn't make sense to me that these characters would be getting a view into true reality, and that true reality would be our world. Spoiler hat off, I honestly think this book could have been a whole series by Philip K. Dick. The world that he paints in this alternate reality has so many huge ramifications on society, like, that he doesn't even get into. I mean, I didn't even mention, but in the Pacific states, African slavery is back. There's a whole thing with how Chinese people are treated versus Japanese people and white people. There's like this apartheid social class system that's only very briefly mentioned explicitly. So I kind of wish he had gone further into that, but just as it stands, this book is famous for a reason. It's a really good book. I think this book works better if you're like me and you're not historically educated, because I have a feeling if you knew more about World War II, you would spend the whole time going like, well, that wouldn't have happened because this people and this people. I don't know, maybe it's actually very well researched, but I think it's more fictional than it is non-fictional. I definitely like this book more than Radio Free Album Youth. It's more focused. I think it's more captivating. The setting is a lot more interesting. And it was an important step in showing that science fiction can still be a genre that supports really heavy ideas about race, about identity, and about philosophy and religion. So that's every book that I read this year. This took a lot longer than I expected it to, which I guess is partially a credit to me for reading more books than I thought I had, and also a detriment that I am incapable of not talking at length about any subject. So, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. All I have to say being, however long this ends up being, an hour and a half. But if anybody is watching this right now, I would be absolutely shocked. Again, this is mostly a record for myself. So yeah, I guess thank me for watching.